listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barber-Gatt with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Last week, there was a real sense of here we go again with another story about bad behaviour among male sports stars behind closed doors. 13 players from AFL club GWS had to be sanctioned over their role in a controversial couples-themed end-of-season party.
The behaviour and the disrespect the players have demonstrated at this event do not uphold any of the values of the AFL or the Giants, and the behaviour is not acceptable in any setting at any time. There is nothing funny or clever about these actions, and we are not, as a code and competition, prepared to accept these behaviours.
That's AFL CEO Andrew Dillon speaking there. We've heard the story of male sporting heroes being sexist jerks behind closed doors so many times before. Does the AFL really think they can change a locker room culture of misogyny that has its hold on sport? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Tuesday, October 22.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Yes, we start today with all the reactions and fallout to that moment. That was Senator Lydia Thorpe disrupting the royal reception of King Charles and Queen Camilla at Parliament House yesterday afternoon. She was escorted out. Footage shows both Camilla and Charles turning to talk to the people next to them as Thorpe was removed from the chamber. Unsurprisingly, though, there's been split reactions on socials and, of course, swift condemnation of the senator's actions, the PM amongst those to label the spectacle disrespectful. An Indigenous elder, Ngunnawal woman Auntie Violet Sheridan, spoke out against what Senator Thorpe did, saying that she does not speak for their community. There has been support as well, though. One man on the ABC's Q&A program last night saying she had put the issue of treaty and truth in the headlines. As to why she did it, well, she spoke to the BBC afterwards saying this.
How can he stand up there and say that he's the king of our country? He's stolen so much wealth from our people and from our land, and he needs to give that back. And he needs to entertain a conversation for a peace treaty in this country. So this story has made global headlines, Chris. I spotted it on the homepages of CNN and the BBC, as well as the New York Times this morning. So the man on Q&A had a point. It's put the issue in the headlines. However, when you look at what the headline of the stories are, it's, Australian politician disrupts King's reception. It's not...
puts
having
First Nation issues in the spotlight.
Yeah, that's right. So, obviously there was going to be split reactions to this. And I guess the question is then, she was saying that in that BBC interview that the King has to step up and tell Australians that we have to have truth and we have to have treaty. It's not his role to do that. And sure, he could come out. We know he speaks out about climate change. King Charles could absolutely come out and say, I believe that we should pursue a more thoughtful path towards reconciliation in Australia or in other countries that he is also the monarch. But his only necessary constitutional function is to actually appoint the Governor-General. And in doing this, the King then gives all his jobs to the GG. Like, that's it. That's done. He has no other role. The Constitution does give the King the power to disallow an Australian Act of Parliament, but this has never, ever been done before, and it is extremely unlikely that it would ever happen. At the end of the day, the conversation that Lydia Thorpe is trying to have about treaty and truth, it's up to us and our politicians to do that, not the King of England.
Yeah, speaking of which, though, the King of England and his wife Camilla, they have their last days in Australia today. So they're in Sydney and will meet with locals at the Opera House, and they'll also be heading to the western suburbs for a community barbecue. And the next stop for them is Samoa, and that's for the Commonwealth Head of Government's meeting. Sash.
We could soon have a new Minister for Digital Affairs, fresh taxes on big tech companies, and cash to support traditional media. Hello. Those are the key recommendations out of a second interim report from the Joint Committee on Social Media and Australian Society. Its focus was on dealing with Meta's decision to end the deals it signed 3 years ago to pay Australian media companies for news. It was a deal made under the Morrison government in 2021, which Facebook and Instagram announced back in March that it would not be renewing.
Yeah, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has commented on this in the past, saying he believes social media companies have a social obligation as well. So for him, that kind of means not harvesting the works of news organisations without compensation. Because at the end of the day, there are journos that are writing all these articles that are are out there. And just compensation is, really nice and rewarding, which we can speak to as journalists. The committee's final report is expected to cover online safety, dealing with the influence of algorithms, the effects of social media on mental health, and age verification tools, Sash.
Yeah, and look, the recommendations handed down doesn't mean it's government policy. They're exactly that, recommendations. And the ministers involved have not immediately commented on the report. It's worth noting it's called a joint committee, but it is controlled by Labor. So there could be pushback from the coalition and from independent senators as well. Look, it's worth noting, though, that this report, it does offer insight into government thinking on media sustainability in this country and the influence of social media companies. The people of Moldova, a country that borders Ukraine, have voted in a razor-thin majority to join the European Union. A referendum held over the weekend showed 50.39% of the population voted yes to inserting a clause in their constitution that would define EU membership as a goal. But there have been allegations of Russian interference in the poll, with President Maia Sandu claiming unprecedented voter fraud and foreign interference had undermined the votes. The EU's executive branch has also noted Moscow meddling in the process and has expressed its support for Moldova's path to membership.
And an Italian surfer has died in a freak accident after being struck by a swordfish off Indonesia's West Sumatra coast. Local authorities say the animal unexpectedly jumped towards the 36-year-old and pierced her chest, leaving a 5-centimetre deep wound. Giulia Manfrini was a surf coach and founder of the surf travel agency A Wave. She's being remembered by her colleagues for her kindness, care and positivity.
Yeah, this is really sad, but it's also extremely rare. Scientists in the past have specified just how unlikely it is to be killed by the animal unless it hits a vital organ. The last reported death was back in 2015 when a fishing boat captain was speared in the chest while he was trying to catch a swordfish in Hawaii. Crazy story, the fact that she was out there and this has happened to her. So I decided to look at what is more common to kill you in the ocean.
Gosh.
Let's be real, we're coming into summer, we live in Australia, we are girt by sea.
Oh, this is not the reporting that people need, Sasha, on a Tuesday morning.
It's a PSA. Look, the box jellyfish is considered the most dangerous sea creature in the world, and it calls Australia home. Of course it does. And also the Aussie blue-ringed octopus, which is also in other countries but very common in Aussie rock pools. I've seen my fair share. It also makes the list. And this is more venomous, and that's the thing. It's not those big scary animals that come out of the deep and bite you. It's the animals that sting you while you're walking through a rock pool or while you're snorkeling or whatever. So, just keep that in mind as we head towards summer. Always be safe in the water and always keep your wits about you. Chris, thanks so much for joining us for the headlines. Next up, we're getting into our deep dive that's looking at misogyny in sport and whether the men's locker room is the last bastion of sexism in Australia.
Hey, Bension here. Last week, the AFL slapped a bunch of sanctions on 13 Greater Western Sydney players for their behaviour at their end-of-season function. The theme was controversial couples, and players dressed in costumes referencing the September 11 terrorist attacks. Josh Fahey, dressed as the former NRL player Jarryd Hayne, performing what the AFL described as inappropriate acts on a sex doll. Several players, including Fahey, copped multi-match bans, and captain Toby Greene was among those hit with significant fines.
The AFL spent a lot of time, resource and energy working with staff, players and clubs to build environments of respect. Respect for women, respect for people of different cultures and respect for the wider community. And unfortunately, as these actions demonstrate, we still have work to do. Respect is not an option. It is a non-negotiable, and we will continue to work until everyone in our game understands that.
But is all this condemnation from the code ultimately futile? What should we make of the argument that this is all just woke politics gone mad? And will there always be a place for misogyny where male sports stars get together behind closed doors? Marnie Vinnell is a sports reporter for ABC Sports. Marnie, welcome to the briefing. Can you just take us through what happened with GWS last week? Talk us through the timeline.
Yeah, it is one of those stories that I feel escapes this AFL sports bubble that I really exist within. But for those that missed it, more than a dozen current and one former GWS player were handed sanctions by the AFL last Thursday for inappropriate behaviour at their post-season function. And the behaviour was labelled by the AFL CEO, Andrew Dillon, as completely unacceptable. So basically, they lost a prelim final, one that they really should have won by 44 points. And in their postseason function, they had a costume theme of troubled couples. And a lot of them went as things that were deemed by the AFL as inappropriate. So you had the severest punishment was handed down to someone who dressed up as former NRL player Jarryd Hayne, and he simulated inappropriate sexual acts on an inflatable doll. You also had players reenact 9/11 and a series of other skits. But the worst punishment was the Jarryd Hayne one, and a lot of women within the AFL community felt particularly hurt, including GWS AFLW players, because of the connotations with this and gendered violence.
How did this news get out there?
This is an interesting one because information was really drip-fed out to the public, which isn't unusual within the AFL realm for stories like this to break kind of gradually as more and more information comes to light. But it was the AFL that were really proactive in handing down these sanctions, and then journalists got wind of all of these GWS players were going to be handed sanctions, and pretty severe ones. So it was originally reported that the captain, Toby Greene, was going to be handed a $20,000 fine for showing a lack of leadership. But because the information was drip-fed out, a lot of the public really kind of grasped onto this and were like, well, they're at a private function, this is wokeness gone mad. A lot of the kind of sentiment was we're punishing these players really hard for a post-season function where they had every right to celebrate/commiserate because they'd lost this really important preliminary final before we actually knew what the sanctions were for. And then the AFL handed down the sanctions, and they did so by calling a snap press conference. So Andrew Dillon fronted the media where he explained the penalties that the GWS players were going to get and why, so their behaviour. And it was CCTV footage that showed as very evident proof what they were up to and what they did. And even with the drip feeding of information, there's this whole notion that, well, it was a bar staff that ratted on these players, where that's not true. It was the CCTV footage that showed what they were actually up to.
How do these consequences rank in the consequences for footballers doing the wrong thing, sort of generally?
These are pretty severe punishments, which a lot of the public has had very strong reactions to. On one side of it, you have a lot of people saying that, well, wokeness gone mad, you shouldn't have players missing 4 games for doing something at a postseason function. And the other hand, you've got a lot of people, particularly women, saying it's good that the AFL have come down so hard and have applied such heavy sanctions because this is really serious behaviour that needs to be stamped out. We saw a lot of sanctions handed down this year in the AFL men's season for homophobia. So there were slurs where players received bans that went up in punishment if the more times that it happened, because they're saying, well, you didn't learn from your peer being sanctioned by saying a slur, so that ban then increased. So you've got, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 5 weeks.
Is the sporting locker room, if we're going to call it that, or these parties or these events where this is a very male-dominated area, all of these people who might be under the influence of alcohol, etc., is this one of the last places that men can do misogyny like this, sort of comfortably?
It's a really interesting question, because historically research has shown that men do feel like sport is a sanctuary for them in a way, that they can behave in ways that they can't now in society. So in ways that society deems unacceptable, men find sport as almost an escape from that, where they don't have to worry about needing to act in a particular manner or take on board all of this education that they get throughout the year. And it is really disheartening to see this because, I mean, you even had the Our Watch CEO come and speak to the GWS players earlier in the year. You had Adam Kingsley, the coach, address the men's players directly saying, you know, you can be a role model in your actions and your words here. And then you get to the end of the season, they all clock off. They go to, and I want to kind of put private function, quote unquote, because it's still a work environment. And there's even the argument that things that are done behind closed doors, that adds weight to how unacceptable these are, because that's also where we see disrespect for women really come to the fore. And so it is disappointing to see the GWS players engage in that kind of behaviour, because I think that you could put two and two together and assume that, yeah, they kind of felt that this was a safe space, in quotation marks, for them to act inappropriately and that be acceptable to their peers.
Speaking of that acceptability, maybe we should address that sort of backlash that there's been to it about this is wokeness gone mad. This is people just policing like fun behaviour that maybe it wasn't meant as it's been heard. What has been the response both in the AFL and elsewhere to that argument?
Yes. So I wrote a piece for ABC Sport last week from the perspective of women in the AFL community, because what I was seeing was a lot of women immediately, even when the sanctions weren't known yet, and it was just that we knew that one of the players went as Jarryd Hayne and there was an incident involving a sex doll, and you can draw those conclusions there. A lot of women were saying how disappointed and shocked they were, and then immediately having such visceral backlash. And I felt like a lot of women were carrying the burden of this incident more than even the players were, because they were on the receiving end of all of this negativity from the public that was in response to, well, why can't we do that? It's just a joke. These are just harmless jokes. Why are we getting sanctioned for harmless jokes? Where we know in research that harmless jokes aren't really harmless when they're about particular topics, because disrespect then underlines a lot of very serious problems within society, like gendered violence.
We've had these consequences and this condemnation, but do you think that this might be futile in the sense that there may always be this comfortable space where certain kinds of men are able to just kind of let it all out, be misogynists, and there aren't real consequences, or at least they're not at the time?
Yeah, and that is one of the most disheartening parts, I think, of a lot of women in this space, including a lot of female journalists who feel like they're fighting without a lot changing. It was 15 years ago that there was the North Melbourne rubber chicken sex incident. And at the time, there was North Melbourne players that were sanctioned, and we jump ahead 15 years and it's the same kind of story. And that is really disheartening to look from the outset. And I had a conversation with a prominent woman in the AFL community who's been involved in advocacy for quite a long time. I was like, well, how do you pick yourself up and not get really discouraged in the face of that? And she said one of the biggest areas of change is there is a groundswell of women now within the community. And so that helps because we all have each other's back and we all are fighting together. And it does change the narrative when it's mostly men still with the microphones within the AFL space, but there are a lot more women there. So there are a lot more women voices that are kind of coming through. But the other is that I saw in some commentary online, I changed my mind, basically, about this. And I listened to all of these voices that were coming through and I changed my mind. And even if those comments are in the minority, there still exists, and I still have to believe that any change is worth it. And all of this work is doing some change. Even if those comments are in the minority, that's still, they've got to hold on to that.
Do you think that we need to see deeper, harder consequences for these kinds of behaviours? Because this isn't even the first time we've talked about this kind of behaviour in 2024.
Yes, very much so, because Earlier in this year, all of the AFL men's players, coaches and umpires stood in the middle of the field, arm in arm, for a moment's silence in recognition and honouring all the victims of gendered violence in Australia. The stat being this year that 1 woman every 4 days is a victim of gendered violence, is murdered because of gendered violence. And so the AFL responded to that by having this moment's silence. And a lot of people at the time said, that's great, as long as there's action backed up behind it. And I do think that the AFL were really proactive in handing down the sanctions to the GWS players, and that is the kind of action that we're talking about. But in order for it to stick, they've got to be severe punishments, because even if that's the way that you change behaviours, is if it's the players being scared of being reprimanded, and then they do kind of work as to like, well, okay, well, actually, why can't I do that? Why can't I dress as this person? Why can't I make those jokes? Even if all of those conversations start to subconsciously happen in the brains, rather than it just being, okay, we'll wear this armband or we'll do this education session, but nothing actually really going in. Like, punishment is a pretty good education tool, unfortunately.
Just finally, do you think now that there is a women's competition at the professional level in the AFL, that will be something that could make a significant change to this kind of culture internally? Yeah,
I really do. And part of that is me feeling hopeful, but I also have spoken to past players, because I was really interested when the women's teams were first coming into the competition, and they came first within in 2017 and then with the expansions. It was 2 years ago that all 18 clubs then had a women's team. And I spoke to a few men who were players in the 80s and the 90s about the culture that existed then. And of course, society has changed a lot since that time, but just in terms of club culture, and they did have this kind of feeling of, like we used to just say words back then and call each other names that you just wouldn't be able to now, because one, society's changed it, but two, because women exist in those places where women were just not previously. And that does, I think, change club culture. Even just if you look at Carlton Football Club. So Carlton Football Club, Darcy Vesio plays for them, who's a non-binary player. And I remember speaking to their CEO, Brian Cook, it was like 2 years ago, and just in conversation, I was asking about the women's team. He was like, women, and gender non-conforming players. And just that it was in his brain and his dialect now to be more inclusive. I think that does have ripple effects within these clubs.
Well, Marnie, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Marnie Vinyl there. She's an ABC sports journalist and podcaster based in Melbourne. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, if there's someone you think might be interested in this episode, please send them a link. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. I'm Ben Sion-Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.